Okay, so I think it's about time to start. So I just want to say good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine, one of the event managers from the Royal Meteorological Society. Welcome to this evening's talk from the East Midlands Local Centre on Weather Photography. I'd just like to run through some housekeeping tips whilst using Teams, and then I'll hand over to Mike Stephen, who will start the meeting. So please can everyone just make sure your microphone is muted and your camera switched off. There is the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen, which you can use to ask questions to the speaker, and the Q&A session will take place at the end of the talk. So I would just like to welcome Mike, hand over to you to start the meeting.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Welcome to the Royal Meteorological Society East Midlands Centre. I'm the chairman of the local centre, and I'm very happy to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Matthew Clark, whose day job is senior scientist at the Meteorological Office. Matthew studied meteorology at the University of Reading, graduating in 2005, and has recently completed a PhD at the University of Leeds. He works in the Met Office on the analysis of severe weather events and the use of crowdsourced data in nowcasting. Nowcasting, for the uninitiated, is very short-range weather forecasting. Of more direct interest to tonight's talk, his amateur interest is taking photographs of the weather, and he held the position of photo editor for the Royal Meteorological Society's Weather Magazine, which is a monthly magazine that we all receive through the Society for 5 years, from 2016 until this year. So I'm very happy to welcome Matt and hand over to him for his talk.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to talk tonight, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'll just share my screen in a second, so hopefully everyone can see the presentation. Right, so hopefully everyone can see that now. Just give me a shout if not, and I'll crack on otherwise. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about weather photography with a sort of particular focus on storms. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit at the beginning about why might people be interested in taking photographs of the weather, and I suppose you can think of it in two ways. So there's a sort of scientific merit, if you like, to taking photographs. So it could be documenting a particular process or particularly well-formed cloud types, or just a particular weather event, some sort of memorable weather event. So there's possible scientific value there to these kind of things. But of course, then there's also the more sort of artistic side, I suppose you might say. So in particular, it goes hand in hand with landscape photography. Of course, you're thinking about the same kinds of things that you would be as a landscape photographer. And I should say at this point that I have absolutely no qualifications as a photographer, so it is purely just a sort of interest-based thing for me. But I think any landscape photographer would probably consider the weather as a very important element of that. And then I guess some people also would undertake this as part of another hobby, for example, something like mountain climbing. So I won't talk too much about the equipment I use. I mean, it's fairly basic, really. But I have used a digital SLR camera now since about 2007. I find it very versatile, very useful, obviously. You can sort of adopt a quantity over quality approach, I find, and then whittle them down to the best ones. And I just use a fairly standard sort of all-purpose type zoom lens. Most of my shots are handheld, but there are certain things that you certainly need a tripod for, and in particular taking photographs of lightning at night. So for this you need the bulb setting on the camera so that you can hold the shutter open almost indefinitely and just wait for the lightning to occur. And obviously for that you've got to mount it on a tripod. So I thought I'd split the talk up into different potential subjects of interest, and these are things that I find myself focusing on mostly with the weather photography. So I've just listed those here, and I'll literally run through those in this kind of order. As I say, there's quite a focus on thunderstorms just because that's one of my particular areas of interest, but also because I've been lucky enough to take some trips to the US storm chasing. Mainly with people I know from the Tornado and Storm Research Organisation here in the UK. So I'll start off with talking about winter conditions, so snow and ice photos. I won't run through all the details that are on the screen here, but the main point I wanted to make here was basically that often you find, particularly in the UK, that altitude makes a very huge difference to the severity of the conditions. So if you are able to get onto higher ground, often you do find that the winter conditions are that much more severe. So with that, I'll move on to the first photograph. So this was taken up in West Yorkshire, so fairly sort of standard snow scene, I suppose. Really nothing particularly unusual about it, but it was just nice to see this person walking their dog in the snow with this red umbrella, which contrasts so strikingly with the fairly monotone remainder of the image there. I just popped this one in. This is taken up on the Chilterns in Oxfordshire. This was in a big snow event in December 2017. It's very marginal on low ground, so some places had sort of rain and sleet, but up on the hills there was a good 15 to 20 centimeters of snow. And I just put this in because it shows something that I quite like with snow. You often there's this very nice sort of blue light on the surface of the snow, particularly just before sunrise or just after sunset, and also earlier in the day just after sunrise, as you can see here. So this is a backlit shot. I've managed to hide the sun just behind one of the branches of the tree there, and I find that you get this beautiful silvery light with snow and frost if you can do kind of backlit scenes like this. So this is one that falls in the category of a kind of pre-planned trip. So I was up staying with family in Yorkshire, and I know this particular area pretty well. It's spectacular, you know, anytime really, whatever the conditions, with this huge limestone pavement that you can see here in the foreground. This is just on the edge of Ingleborough in the Yorkshire Dales. You can see the Ingleborough itself just on the right hand side there. But there'd been a snowfall overnight, and I'd planned to get up very, very early to park in Ingleton, which is relatively low down, and then walk up onto the hills to capture this scene. And this is exactly the same spot, but just about exactly a year later. So on the sort of face of it, it was very similar weather conditions, but I think you can see here that the photograph's quite different. The feel of the photograph is quite different. So this medium level Alto Cumulus cloud had moved in from the west, and when I set up, actually I thought this was going to ruin things by blocking the sun, but actually as it happened, it didn't quite block the sun on the eastern horizon, and I think it adds some interest to the shot here. And another nice subject for photos in winter, of course, is snowdrifts. This example again was up in the Yorkshire Dales on the moor top between Wharfdale and Littondale. I tend to find with snowdrifts, it's good to try and look on the map actually for exposed walls on ridge tops, because they seem to sort of collect the largest snowdrifts, particularly if the wall runs perpendicular to the prevailing wind. But you can see the kind of amazing detail that you get in the snowdrifts here. and also these interesting textures you get on the surface of the snow. So of course these tend to be best seen when you've got fairly low angle sunlight, which you do rather more obviously in the winter. Here's another example, just illustrating that last point a little more. So this was taken on Dartmoor just after sunrise. I think it was only about 15-20 minutes after sunrise, and you can see how that really low light is just picking out all the details in the top of the snow there. You can even see sort of individual little bits sparkling in the top of the snow there. So this is all the way back in February 2009, and I don't know if anyone can remember, but it was a particularly nasty snow event over parts of southwest England in particular on this occasion. So down at sea level it was very marginal. So I live in central Exeter, and although it snowed all night, it was extremely wet, so we just had about 1 or 2 inches of slush on the ground in the morning. But actually on top of the hills around about, even very sort of modest hills, just 100 or 200 meters above sea level, there was a lot more snow, so anything from 1 to 2 feet of snow. So this is the morning after the bulk of the snow fell, and you can see that it was still drifting in the winds at this time. This is up just near Silverton. It's about 250 meters above sea level in sort of mid-Devon. But then I went back the next day because the sky finally cleared out, and obviously the light was much better then to try and capture some shots of the drifts. So I found in Devon these very deep lanes with the very high hedges. They tend to be particularly good for trapping the snow. So if I move on to the next photograph, you can see how the winds actually swept the snow more or less. Some of the fields around about have been swept almost clean of the snow by the wind, and it's all been dumped into this lane here. So it's quite interesting how it does that. I haven't seen that so much up in Yorkshire, for example. So maybe it's something to do with those deep lanes with the hedges. So this is another phenomenon, if you like. So this is rye mice now. So those sort of spiky patterns on the windward side of the rock there. This is up on Dartmoor again. So the rye mice forms when you have freezing fog. So that's fog with temperatures below freezing point. And what happens is that the individual little water droplets that make up the fog, they actually exist in liquid form, even though the temperature is below freezing. But as soon as they hit any sort of solid surface, they'll freeze instantly. So as more and more droplets, hit any particular object on the ground, then you get this buildup of ice. So on this occasion, it wasn't particularly thick. There was a few centimeters maybe, but it can build up on mountain tops to well over 1 meter in thickness sometimes. This is another example of rye mice again. This is up on the top of Buckden Pike in North Yorkshire, just last winter actually. This is up at about 700 meters above sea level. And this is pretty much the same location, but literally just turning the camera around 180 degrees to look the other way. So you can see the quality of the light quite different just by rotating 180 degrees there. That bank of cloud you can see, incidentally, that moved across the top of the fell within a few minutes that this photograph was taken, and that was it. We were in thick fog after that, so that was pretty much the end of the opportunities on this occasion for sort of nice sunlit photos. So this again is rye mice, but this is a bit lower down now. So we're on the Blackdown Hills in Devon. This is back in December 2010, which again a lot of people may remember as an absolutely exceptionally cold month, and in some places very snowy month. In the southwest, most of the month was just pretty dry but very, very cold. And on this occasion, there was about 3 days of freezing fog on the tops of the Blackdowns. We have an observing station at Dunk as well, which is only about a mile from where this shot was taken. You could see from the time series of the observations that this site had been anything from -3 to -7 for the past 3 days with thick fog. So conditions were just perfect for this rime ice to build up. And then on this particular morning, well, overnight at some point, all the fog and low cloud cleared. So I got up early to try and get there in time for sunrise. So obviously this kind of phenomenon, it looks at its most spectacular when you've got the sun on it again. But it's a bit of a catch-22 because obviously it all starts melting usually as soon as the sun's on it. So you really need to be there if you can right around sunrise to really capture it at its best. This is the same occasion actually, but just slightly further north in the Black Downs again. And actually the weight of ice, it accumulated so thickly on some of the branches it had brought them down onto the road. So this is more of a, I suppose, sort of a macro shot, really, just showing the detail of hoarfrost, so individual frost crystals, which can look quite spectacular when they get thick like this. I don't think it was particularly foggy on this occasion, but quite a thick deposit of frost nevertheless. And then there are particular events that stick in the memory, and a recent one that I'm sure that the vast majority of people will remember is March 2018, the so-called Beast from the East. And then certainly in parts of the south anyway, there was a second event, even more interestingly named the Mini Beast from the East, which was about 2 weeks later on. And actually in Devon, both of these events produced quite large snowfalls. So this first shot was taken in the kind of main Beast from the East event on the 1st of March. And I think you can probably see this isn't the prettiest landmark in Exeter, but it's the main kind of road bridge over the River Exe, and I just took this because it's pretty unusual to see that much ice on the river. Probably the most unusual thing about this event in the Devon area was the freezing rain. So that there was about several hours of heavy snow, and it dropped maybe 15 or 20 centimeters of snow. But then around late evening on, I think it was the 1st of March or the day before, I can't remember now. But anyway, at sort of late evening, the snow changed over to rain. Yet the surface temperature was still sort of -2, -3. So this rain then froze as soon as it hit anything on the ground, with it being several degrees below freezing. And by morning, there was this build up, maybe half a centimetre or a centimetre of glaze ice. So you can see it on this car quite clearly here. Here's another shot of the same thing. This was on a rhododendron bush, I think. And then this is sort of the middle of March, so this was the second event. There'd been about a week of mild weather between these two events, but the cold air came back with a vengeance, and it dropped again about 15 to 20 centimetres of snow in the Exeter area on the 18th of March. And I was able to walk up onto the hills just to the west of Exeter, where these shots are taken. So it was a very strong sort of easterly, northeasterly wind with the snow, and just after the snow actually, so these really good drifts formed. This is about 3 miles out of Exeter, so it was quite nice to be able to walk up to it. So some of the drifts here were sort of anything, certainly at least 2 meters deep. On again, you can see it's one of these lanes with the very tall hedges, which just seems to almost collect the snow in these events. You can also see here the really interesting sort of textures you get on the surface of the snow. It's really nice to see the snow with such strong sunshine on it. It's not something that happens very often, actually. And in that first Beast from the East event at the beginning of March 2018, the skies were absolutely leaden for days and days after the event. So there wasn't really any opportunity to get photos of the snow with the sunshine on it. So two quite different feeling events, really, in a way, and certainly in terms of the photographic opportunities. So I'll move on now to fog, and I suppose you know, at first sight, this might seem a slightly weird subject for photography, but the key here is to see if you can try and get above the layer of fog. So, for example, when you get radiation fog on clear, cold nights, the cold air tends to sink to the lower ground, and then if you live in a hilly area, you can actually get up above the fog layer and get these nice photos above it. And also, when the sun shines through the fog, you can get various optical effects, which I'll go on to show in a second. So this is the kind of scene that you see very often. It's not uncommon, but I just, there's something about these kind of situations that I particularly like. So often find myself getting up in the morning and getting out for sunrise on these kind of mornings. So this is just looking down the Tean Valley in Devon on the edge of Dartmoor. Here's another shot looking over the sort of lower Exe Valley. It was particularly interesting on this occasion because a sort of light southerly wind picked up above the fog layer, and it just started to create these ripples that you can see. There's almost a sort of Kelvin Helmholtz type wave going on there on the edge of the fog, where the winds, I suppose, interacting with the hills there in the middle distance. The Devon landscape's also really nice because it's got so many sort of small undulations, little hills and valleys. You can really get this very interesting sort of detail in the fog layer on these mornings. This is another one in Devon, a little further south now, just near Dawlish. But on this occasion, the tops of the Holden Hills were just poking out above the fog, so some of the individual shoulders of land were sort of going off down into the fog, which created some nice photo opportunities. This one, I think it's a pretty well photographed hill. This one, I can't remember the name of it, but it's by the A35 near Bridport, just between Bridport and Lyme Regis. It looks very sort of dramatic with that clump of pine trees on the top there, but even more so on this particular occasion with the hill just rising out of this layer of morning fog. So this is a similar kind of effect, but different type of fog now. So this is an advection fog over the English Channel. So there was a very warm, moist air mass that had spread north, and the sea surface temperatures. This was in May, so they were still relatively cool. So the cold waters cool the air above it to below the dew point temperature, and so this marine fog forms. Particularly common in especially on the east coast, actually, of the UK in the spring and early summer. But in East Devon, some of the cliffs are high enough that you can actually get just above that marine fog layer to get these kind of views. Another really nice effect in fog, if you can get yourself near to the top of the fog layer, or if it's just a shallow fog layer that the sun's shining through, you get really nice crepuscular rays. These can be particularly striking if you go into woodlands because of all the sort of branches that the shadows that the branches cast on the fog create these really nice rays. Here's another example from the Holdens. I've sort of deliberately overexposed this one a little bit just because it seems to bring out the detail in those rays a bit more. And a similar effect you can see here through horse chestnut tree. This is just in a park in Exeter. Again, you can get really nice effects when you sort of point straight towards the sun if you can find something to take away the worst of the glare of the sun. So it almost looks like this tree is on fire or something in this shot. This is taken by the River Exe, just downstream from Exeter. And then this is the same location actually. So this is a pub called the Double Locks. They have a firework display every year, and we went down to look at the fireworks, but it was a bit of an added bonus that there was this layer of ground fog over the fields by the river. So it added an extra element of interest to the photos on this occasion. So I'll move on now to coast and sea shots. I suppose it'd be a bit remiss of me not to say this, especially where I work, but obviously when you get really stormy weather, the advice is to stay away from the coast. And of course, if you want to get nice spectacular shots of the sea crashing onto the coast, you're going to do the exact opposite of that. So obviously safety is paramount, and it can be really worthwhile actually with this kind of shot to know the location, to visit the location in good conditions and work out where you might get the good viewpoints. So one particular event that I thought I'd talk about was the 5th of February 2014. So you might remember this event because this was the one that produced a lot of damage on the mainline railway at Dawlish in Devon. It basically destroyed the line and put it out of action for several months. But the computer models were suggesting in this case that there would be a particularly large swell coming into the southwest of the UK. In association with this really deep low pressure area that you can see there in the surface analysis chart on the right hand side. So this had developed across the Atlantic and moved east towards the UK, and this huge swell had built up with it, and so it was approaching the Cornwall coast. It was predicted to be about 20 to 30 feet, so around about 10 meters, and that's in open water, and it tends to mound up even more as it comes into the coastline. So I went down to Porthleven, which is just shown there on the map, which is fully exposed to a swell from the southwest. High tide was at 9 o'clock on this day, so I got up early to get down in time for high tide, and this is what it looked like. So it's pretty spectacular. You'll probably recognise the view because it's a shot that people often, a viewpoint that people often go to in these kind of conditions. But on this occasion, it really was particularly extreme. Just for scale, you can see the house in the distance there, just on that low cliff. That's about 30 meters above sea level. So it gives you an idea about the size of the waves and the crashing spray. The light wasn't fantastic on this day. It was pretty cloudy, but you can see there's some brightness, so it wasn't completely flat. But there were just a few glimpses of sunshine. You can see how it really transforms a scene. So the sun was just off to the sort of right of the shot there. Also lucky on this occasion was that the wind had veered round to the west, and this is kind of pointing towards the southeast. So it was carrying any spray away from the lens. It's sort of pointing broadly downwind. So if you can possibly manage to get that set up, it really helps, because the sea spray on the lens really is probably the worst challenge in these kind of weather conditions. This again is Cornwall, but this is another event now. So this is February 2016, down near Kynance Cove. Same occasion, same location. I just put this in because again, it was sort of pointing roughly towards the sun here, and you can get some really nice effects with the spray backlit. Though obviously you have to be careful to try and keep the highlights from blowing out. And then another spot that I suppose a lot of people will recognise, this is the mainline railway that I mentioned earlier at Dawlish. So this was 2017, so it had long since been repaired, but you can see there it is under attack again from the sea. I've zoomed in quite a lot here just to try and accentuate the size of that wave compared to the train, just to add a bit of drama to the shot. It wasn't particularly stormy conditions, but the lighting was fantastic on this day. I just put this one in because it illustrates probably the main problem with these kind of photos is the timing difficulties. So I guess most people go there because they want to get a really nice shot of a train just approaching with a huge wave crashing over it. I haven't yet managed a single sort of standout shot of that yet. You see, in this case, the train had just just passed under the bridge that I was standing on. So if maybe the train had been 1 or 2 seconds later, I could have got the front of the train with this huge wave. But I guess that's just part of the challenge. So and what makes it so enjoyable to do this kind of photography. So I'll move on now to the first of 2 sections actually that I've got on the sort of convection, so showers and thunderstorms. And I thought I'd split this into photographs I've taken in the UK, and then at the end of the presentation I'll show some photos from these storm chasing trips that I've done to the States. So just starting off with the UK, I just threw this one in really to illustrate one point about the sort of showery polar maritime air masses that we get so often in the UK. So these are the kind of broadly westerly air streams that bring lots and lots of showers in off the Atlantic. And the convection in these situations it's pretty modest, to be honest, especially by the standards of sort of summer convection in continental areas. Pretty low topped and not especially energetic, but actually you can get really good photos, really nice effects, and I think that's partly because the visibility tends to be so excellent in these polar maritime air masses, as hopefully you can see in this photo. But also because the convection tends to be smaller scale, you can actually see the whole sort of form of the convective cells. So this particular cloud here, nothing particularly unusual about it. It's a cumulonimbus that's just kind of entering its mature stage, and you can see that shaft of sunlight precipitation there towards the bottom, just right of centre of the photo. But because it's fairly small scale, you can see the entire thing in one go, which is not always possible to do with summer thunderstorms, for example, which tend to be much larger. So you can't see the whole thing really from any one vantage point. Another nice thing actually is when you get wintry showers, so hail and sleet and snow. As a general rule with solid precipitation, that the falling precipitation looks a lot more opaque. So the kind of fall streaks, the virga and the precipitation streaks that you get look often a lot more dramatic than they do when it's just rain. So hopefully you can see that in this photograph towards the bottom right hand side of the image there. And another photograph just showing that kind of effect again. So this was a really sort of light snow flurry that had just blown across Dartmoor and was heading out towards the Devon coast towards Teignmouth. It was a very tiny shower, but you can see the falling snow there, and it was just really nicely lit up by the morning sun. I put this one in just because I wanted to talk about sunlight and storm clouds. So often you find you can make the image look a lot more dramatic if you can just wait for that glimpse of sun, because it lightens up the rest of the landscape relative to the storm cloud, so it makes the storm cloud look that much darker. This was taken near Ottery St Mary, actually looking towards the Blackdown Hills with this downpour of rain. It didn't produce any thunder, which is a bit strange. I'm not sure why. Perhaps it wasn't deep enough, but it certainly looked spectacular anyway. Again, this is in East Devon. This was from the cliff tops just near Sidmouth. And this is quite a nice example of Arcus Cloud. So those little pouches you can see on the underside of the anvil of this shower. Again, it was a pretty weak shower, really. I guess at some point it might have had some vigorous growth, but it's just interesting to see such well-formed Martis in relatively weak convection. So you see some amazing photos of this type of cloud, particularly from the Great Plains of the US, where they get these colossal thunderstorms, particularly in the spring. But it's nice that you can see some of these cloud types with just in sort of typical showery weather in the UK too. So this is just another shot at the same time, but the sun was setting, and you can see how the light changes. So again, as with a lot of cloud detail, it tends to stick out It's much more visible in low angle light, so near sunrise and sunset. And this is another effect that you can get with thunderstorms. It's called a whale's mouth effect. So what's happening here is that the leading edge of the rain-cooled air that spreads out away from the storm that had passed overhead, it's called the gust front of the storm. So that the low cloud base you see in the distance marks the leading edge of this cold air flowing out of the storm. And then up behind and above that gust front, you see this extremely turbulent looking cloud. It almost looks like the sky's boiling. The storm cores off to the lower left of the photograph here. So it's probably about the best example of that effect I've seen in the UK to date. This was in Harrogate in North Yorkshire in August 2020. This is the same kind of thing actually, but you're looking at it from the other side now. So I'm standing ahead of the gust front, and you see it as a sort of roll of low cloud when you're standing ahead of it. It's sometimes called an Arcus Cloud. And these tend to be really particularly well formed when the showers and storms form into lines. So I've just put a radar image at the lower left there. So those red and pink and white shades just show where you've got the very heavy precipitation. You can see how that's formed a sort of a curving line across East Devon, and that black dot just shows where I was standing at the time of this photograph. This is a composite of about 3 or 4 images that I've stitched together. But this is definitely something that's worth looking out for when you see the showers lining up into bands like this on the radar. So I'll move on now to talk about optical phenomena. So I'm talking about things here like halos and other halo phenomena that you can get in ice clouds, so cirrus and cirrostratus. I've listed a few of the more common ones just at the top there. So with these kind of features, they do range from relatively common to extremely rare, so you never quite know what you're going to see. I think these things demonstrate in particular why it's really worth having your camera with you all the time, because you just don't know when you're going to see them, and it's often opportunistic. You just have to take them wherever you are. So you'll see with some of these photos that they're not beautifully sort of posed shots with really nice backgrounds. It's just a case of getting the phenomena when it occurs. So I thought I'd just put this one in of a rainbow to start with. So obviously pretty common phenomenon, but they can be really striking when they're really well formed like this one. So you can see the secondary bow there, complete secondary bow, as well as the primary. And this was taken just near Newton Abbot in Devon, so you can see Dartmoor in the distance there. And this shower wasn't particularly strong actually. It was a decaying shower, but the light just happened to be right. And it was very much a case of pot luck, because I was just driving along actually. I had not gone out to take photos, and this thing just happened, so I stopped and took a photo. I find it's well worth trying to get to an elevated vantage point if you possibly can on showery days, because when rainbows occur, you can see just that little bit more of the bow if you're standing high up. So if the sun's behind you and you've got a nice steep drop in front of you, as was the case here. So this was taken on Stoke Hill, which is just north of Exeter. And you also get this effect where the bow sort of appears to, in front of some of the landscape, which I think adds to the drama of the shot. It somehow gives it a bit more 3-dimensionality to the photo. So this is a 22-degree halo around the moon, so pretty common occurrence, but nevertheless quite spectacular when you see them. So this was just taken out of my living room window. There's no room for a tripod, so it's just handheld, so I had to crank up the ISO number here. So that's what you can see. It's a little bit grainy. This is in some ways a related phenomenon. It's called a parhelion, sometimes known as a mock sun or sundog, and these just form on that 22-degree halo, you don't always see the halo, but they're positioned on the halo, but either side of the sun. So in this case, the sun was just to the left of the shot, but you can see you can get some really nice coloration in these features. And here's another one. So this is Brocken Spectre and Glory. So the Brocken Spectre is a kind of, you can see my shadow there. It's just cast onto a fog bank and hillside in the distance. And then the Glory is those rings of coloured lights that are around the shadow. Usually these are seen in mountainous regions where people are looking down on a layer of cloud or a bank of fog below them. And this one here isn't a particularly well-formed one, but I just wanted to throw it in there to show that you can see some of these more unusual phenomena just in sort of fairly, well, certainly not mountainous terrain anyway, so just fairly modest hills here. And this is another example of glory, so these coloured rings of light around my shadow. But this time it was in a very shallow layer of ground fog. So you see this fog is only about 1 metre or 2 deep. So there's not much of a path through the fog here, but I guess it's just enough to create this effect. And another really nice one with fog is fog bows. So it's a similar idea here to a rainbow, but because the fog droplets are so much smaller than your typical raindrops, the sort of predominant mechanism at work is diffraction, and the light isn't split up into its component colours as you get with a rainbow. So you just end up with this fairly broad, sort of diffuse white bow. Not always very easy to see. Often they're very faint, but it's the same kind of idea. So you need the sun to be shining quite strongly onto a bank of fog to get these, and because of that, often they tend to occur just as the fog in the morning starts to dissipate. So you can have a really brief window of opportunity to see it, really. So in this case, the fog had completely dispersed within 10 or 15 minutes of this photo being taken. So another example here, this was actually the very next morning. So it was this was just in October this year, actually. So it was a bit of a spate of fog bows in the Exeter area. But on this occasion, I drove up to some of the hills a couple of miles outside of Exeter just to try and get to the top of the fog layer where the sun was shining through, and lo and behold, it was possible to see this phenomenon again. This is the same spot, but I just walked to the edge of a steep hill, and if you look carefully in the lower centre of the photo there, you can just about make out this Brocken Spectre effect again, just very faintly. So another thing that's particularly nice to capture is rare clouds or particularly good examples of certain cloud types. So one example of this is Noctilucent Clouds. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard about these, but these are very high altitude clouds. So they form anything from sort of 50 to 80 kilometers above ground level. So much higher than the normal tropospheric clouds. Because of their height, they can remain sunlit for some time, even after sunset at ground level. This is best seen usually in the summer, where you have a sort of long twilight. And so they tend to be best seen maybe an hour or two after sunset or before sunrise. This example was taken just on Midsummer's Evening, actually, this year in Yorkshire. And another shot on the same night, just to give a slightly wider view of it here. Another one I thought I'd just quickly talk about is Alto Cumulus Lenticularis clouds. So these are these mountain wave clouds, sometimes known as sort of flying saucer clouds or similar kind of names. But these form when you have a stable sort of atmosphere and strong flow across a range of hills or mountains. So that sets up waves in the flow. And sometimes these clouds form in the crest of the waves, as I've tried to show in this little diagram here. And the clouds actually, they sort of look like they're hovering, they're more or less stationary, but actually the air's flowing through them the whole time in this standing wave pattern. So I thought I'd just put in one example that I've seen, easily the best example I've seen of these in the UK. This was in Yorkshire again, back in December 2011. You can see, there's this beautiful sort of stacked layers effect that you can get with these clouds. It's interesting they're so well formed because the Pennines aren't particularly high, obviously, in the grand scheme of things, but I guess the conditions must have been just right. It was strong sort of flow with a sort of anticyclonic curvature in a broad warm sector, with the flow more or less perpendicular to the Pennine Ridge. And here again, this is just a bit more zoomed into the northern end of this band of clouds. You can see some really nice small scale detail as well. So if you look towards the top right of the photo here, you can just see these small sort of Kelvin Helmholtz billows on the edge of one of the cloud layers here. So I'll move back onto a sort of stormy subject again now, and I thought I'd talk about lightning shots. So I'm thinking specifically about nighttime lightning shots now. And as I mentioned at the beginning, for this you need to use the bulb setting on the camera. Excuse me. So this is why you just literally hold the shutter open almost indefinitely. So you need to mount it on a tripod. But in practice, how long you can expose each shot for is limited by the amount of ambient sort of light. So if there's a lot of light in the scene, then it really limits each shot to a few seconds. But the idea is that you just hold the shutter open until the lightning bolt occurs. And of course, digital photography makes this so much easier because it doesn't matter if 95% of your shots have no lightning in them, as perhaps it would a bit more back in the days of film. So this was taken in Dorset, just quite a small thunderstorm. Actually, it developed about 10 miles off the shore and then trundled onto the shore, producing some really nice cloud-to-ground lightning bolts. This is about the last shot of lightning I got on this night, because you can perhaps see in the photo there how close the leading edge of the torrential rain is. So within a minute of this, the torrential rain was on me, so I was diving for the car. And actually, this is something you find a lot with storm photography. You've got to be pretty near the storm for the lightning to be close enough to get decent shots. But of course, then the chances are you'll be very near or within the rain. So you tend to have a very, very limited window of opportunity to capture those shots, unless you're very lucky and you've got a sort of line of storms that's perhaps passing just a few miles to the side of you and you can stay out of them. But that doesn't seem to happen very often, or certainly not in Devon anyway. This is another one in Cornwall back in July 2014. I struggled a little bit this night because I didn't know the area and I couldn't find a decent vantage point. So you can see that part of that lightning bolt's kind of hidden behind a hedge and a bit of a hillside. So it was a pretty frustrating night in that respect, but nevertheless some nice cloud detail and nice detail of the lightning channels in this shot. This was the same night actually when I finally found a better viewpoint. There was a quite a long line of storms passing to the west, so you can see this very long horizontal discharge of lightning here. Another example of that kind of thing, this was in a very dramatic thunderstorm that moved in from the south coast, affected much of southern England actually on the 19th of July 2017. Again, you can see I was suffering a little bit with not being able to find a decent viewpoint, but I did eventually manage to find my way to the seafront at Bournemouth, and then pretty late in the night managed to capture this shot of lightning striking the sea about a mile off the shore from Bournemouth. I just thought I'd zoom in to this same shot again just to show some of the detail, because you can see there's an amazing amount of branching going on in this lightning strike. And also it's really nice to see that the lightning actually splits. It splits into two main forks there just before it hits the sea. And if you look really closely at the left-hand fork just above the sea, you can see that it actually seems to split another time just above the sea surface. And then moving on another couple of years now, this is back in Exeter. This is probably the last sort of decent opportunity for lightning photos I've had in the UK. Back in July 2019. So this particular storm had moved over Exeter. It produced almost continuous lightning within the cloud, but it wasn't very good for photos because you couldn't see any of the lightning channels. But as it moved north and started to move away from Exeter, it started to produce these cloud to ground bolts. So I managed to capture one of these with the city of Exeter just sort of in the foreground. This was the same night, second storm. It trundled up from the south a few miles further west. Again, there was perhaps only 5 or 10 minutes to capture these kind of shots, but fortunately the storm really produced during that period. This was just looking south towards Dartmoor, so managed quite a good vantage point on this occasion. So I mentioned that I'd just finish off by talking about US thunderstorms. So I've got about 10 minutes of photos here, just to show from 3 years of storm chasing trips to the States. So there's a very well-defined storm season in the central sort of third, roughly, of the US, anytime from April through May and June. And so quite a lot of people, if they've got any interest in storms and weather photography, they take trips out to the States, and you're literally just looking to try and pick the areas that look most favourable for storms. You can drive thousands of miles in a 2 or 3 week trip. But I thought I'd start off with this shot of a huge thunderstorm in North Texas. This was in May 2009, just lit up by the setting sun. And these storms, they really are on just a different scale out there. They're absolutely colossal. You've got huge amounts of energy because there's a lot of moisture, but also you have favourable wind shear. So this is changing winds of changing speed and direction with height in the atmosphere, and that's just needed to help sort of organise the storms and sculpt them into these huge, severe, long-lived thunderstorms, often with rotating updrafts, and they produce very large hail and damaging outflow winds and tornadoes even sometimes. This is another storm, not particularly severe, but it was a very high base thunderstorm, and high base storms tend to be very good for lightning photos because you see a lot of the lightning channel below the cloud base. So this was up in the far southwest corner of Iowa. And this is another storm on the same night. So this storm just erupted out of nothing in sort of 5 or 10 minutes. I could just dimly see a line of cloud to our north, and then suddenly, almost like someone switching a light on, it started flickering away, almost continuous lightning. So you can see a lot of that lightning was within the cloud there, but hopefully that photo gives some idea of what was going on. And then this is maybe an hour later, we'd driven back to the hotel we were staying at, and this line of storms had approached a little bit closer. So you can see this amazing wall of cloud lit by the lightning, and then if you look towards the bottom of the photo, you can see these streaks of precipitation falling out at the bottom. Not the best viewpoint, but by this stage it was very much a case of just trying to capture what I could. And that's literally looking at the hotel we stayed in that night. But this is a nice example of spider lightning or amble crawler lightning. As the name suggests, this forms in the sort of upper reaches of the storm cloud, the amble. So this is a large spreading region of cloud mass that often spreads out ahead of the storm. And when you get these really active storms like these ones in the States, they can be very electrically active with these huge discharges rippling through the amble, as you can see here. This was the next day. In Nebraska, a line of severe thunderstorms. It was producing 70 to 80 mile an hour outflow winds. It was moving pretty quickly, so again that limits the photo ops. Really, it's just very brief snaps getting out the car and then back in the car to race ahead of the storm again. But if you look closely towards the bottom left-hand side of the photo there, you can perhaps see some of the dust that's being kicked up by these very strong winds flowing out of the storm. And that slight green coloration you get there, sometimes people say that's indicative of hail within these storms. This is another one that this time in Colorado. It's particularly nice the way the evening sunlight was shining through the rain core of this storm. I was trying to get that beautiful lighting with a cloud to ground lightning bolt, but unfortunately wasn't able to capture any of those, so this was the best I could do in terms of the lighting. Here's another lightning shot with a bit of ambient lighting in the background there. That often adds just a bit more interest to the shot. This photograph shows a supercell thunderstorm. So supercells are just storms that contain a deep rotating updraft. So that's that kind of dark cloud mass you can see just towards the left of center of that photo. And what tends to happen is the updraft is separate from the downdraft. So you can see on the right-hand side here, this diffuse area is where all the precipitation's falling out, where the downdraft is. So they're literally side by side, which means the storm can persist much longer than an ordinary storm. And actually, that precipitation doesn't look particularly threatening, but it was producing hail of at least golf ball size in this case. You can see the lightning occurring there as well, close to the interface between the updraft and the downdraft. Here's another example of spider lightning. So this was in a huge storm complex over South Dakota. So the core of the storm's way away to our west. You can maybe just make out a faint cloud to ground lightning bolt towards the lower right of the photo there. But we were under the Amble region again with these colossal spider lightning strikes going on. So this was our last chase day in 2010 in the far southeast of Colorado, and it turned out to be a memorable day, in spite of limited expectations really. So the atmosphere wasn't it was fairly quiescent. I think that the forecast was calling for isolated storms, and there might be some marginally severe weather, so maybe some hail about an inch in diameter, that kind of thing, some gusty winds. But in the event, pretty much just one main storm cell went up, and through the afternoon it just got stronger and stronger and more organized, so that by late afternoon it was a very large, intense supercell. So the photograph here, that sort of lumpy cloud that you can see towards the center and left of center, that's the base of this huge rotating updraft. Again, on the right hand side you can see the precipitation core of the storm, and at this point the storm was producing tennis ball size hail, so we had, for obvious reasons, to be careful to keep out of that rain core. But the most memorable event of this particular day happened, it was about 6:15 in the evening, I think. So we were under the updraft of the storm, and suddenly a new funnel cloud started to form just to our south, only about half a mile away. Very quickly, within a minute or two, this extended down to the ground and then touched down, as you can see here. It was remarkable, really, because often tornadoes they're quite shrouded in precipitation, they're quite low contrast, but on this occasion, as you can see, the air was completely clear around the tornado. You even got blue sky behind it. Apologies for my clock there, which I forgot to stop. But anyway, this thing just kept getting more and more powerful, and eventually it started to kick up dust. So I just zoomed in here, and you can see the dust starting to be raised here. And as the tornado matured, it just got broader and broader, and this dust cloud got more and more well developed. So this is about when the tornado was reaching its most intense phase. It was rated as an EF2. That's on a scale that runs from 0 to 5, with 5 being the most intense. But the thing is, it was moving across open prairie, so there's very little for it to damage. So it snapped some power poles on a roadside that it crossed and destroyed a couple of farm outbuildings. But fortunately, other than that, the damage was limited. It would have been a different story, obviously, if this went through a town. So as I say, yeah, this is about when the tornado was at its most intense. So we had this amazing view of it. We had to actually drive eventually towards the tornado because the rain and hail core behind us was slowly advancing. So we had to keep out of the hail, which ironically meant traveling towards the tornado. So this is us just starting to drive down the road towards it, although actually the road bends in the distance there. So the tornado had actually crossed the road by this stage. And after about 20 minutes on the ground, it slowly started to dissipate. So it was actually on the ground at this time. It's still kicking up dust, but you can see the funnel clouds becoming shorter. And the rain and hail was starting to wrap round, but just briefly in the closing sort of stages of that tornado, it was this amazing combination of a rainbow with the dissipating tornado, which was fantastic to see. And very quickly, because sorry, I'm overrunning a little now. My last chasing trip was in 2017. This is another example of a supercell in the Texas Panhandle. So again, the rotating updraft there, you can see the base of it with that very dark, sort of hard-looking cloud mass there, and that conspicuous region of heavy-looking precipitation. That's where you'd expect the largest hail to be. And again, I think the storm was producing hail at least 2 inches in diameter. We drove towards the west after this storm cleared through to the north, and we could see some hail on the roadside where the storm had passed through. And we were lucky enough again to see a tornado. So this was in Texas, in the Texas Panhandle. So the lighting wasn't perhaps as good as that event back in 2010, but it was fantastic to see nevertheless. Eventually, we ended up getting quite close to this tornado in its closing phases. And we were treated to a really nice sort of example of how tornadoes often dissipate. So this is a process called roping out. The tornado tends to get narrower and narrower until it completely fizzles. So you can see in this photo it's starting to enter that rope out phase. And then here it is really in the final stages of that process. You can see just how thin the funnel is there. But actually, if you look really carefully towards the lower left of the photo, you can see it's actually still got a ground contact point, rather remarkably for such a thin funnel. It's another shot of lightning, this time in Oklahoma. So again, this storm was producing almost continuous cloud-to-cloud lightning, and it was quite dazzling because we were out in the open countryside and there were no other lights around. So it's just this sort of strobe lighting effect. It's quite disorientating almost, and then these occasional clouds of ground bolts. Here's another shot of Montmartres, but this maybe gives some idea of the scale of the anvil of these huge storms in the States. So this anvil was stretching for tens and tens of miles away from the core of the storm. This is the same day, actually, a bit later in the evening. We were traveling back towards the hotel, but the storm behind us started producing some really spectacular lightning. So we stopped for about 10-15 minutes to get some shots of that. And this particular bolt jumped out from the top of the storm, and then it hit the ground quite a few miles ahead of the leading edge of the storm, actually. It's a very powerful looking lightning bolt. This is another example of an Arcus Cloud. So this is at the leading edge of typically a line of storms. And this happens where the cold air outflow that's spreading away from the storm, it forces the warmer air ahead of the storm to be lifted up into the storm. And that lifting creates this sort of band of cloud that you can see. And again, you can see this kind of greenish tinge to the storm that I mentioned before. And then finally, this was a very severe storm, actually, just right on the Colorado-Kansas border. They have a habit of naming towns a sort of amalgamation of the two states. So this was near a place called Colorado. But this particular storm was producing sort of 70 to 80 mile an hour outflow winds and tennis ball size hail. It was moving very quickly as well. So again, we had just brief opportunities to catch photos before getting in the car and racing away from this thing again. So that's the end of the photos. Sorry for sort of galloping through those and overrunning a little bit. I just wanted to say at the end, if this has inspired you to take weather photos, or if you already take photos, then please do consider submitting your photos to the Royal Met Society's weather magazine. So the current photo editor, Kevin Thomas, and I'm sure he'll be very pleased to receive any photos at the email address shown in red there. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Well, thank you very much. My first comment is, wow, that was amazing. We have quite a number of questions lined up, so I'll do a bit of a selection. First one from Clinton Caruana, like some tips on photographing thunderstorms, camera settings, and so on, and how you stay safe when photographing lightning.
Sure.
And finally, how do you photograph lightning during the day?
So I guess with the settings, it kind of depends what you're photographing, but I can talk about the sort of nighttime lightning photography. So as I mentioned, you need to use a bulb setting on the camera. So this allows you to just hold the shutter open indefinitely. You can either do that by holding the shutter button down, literally physically, or you could use a cable release. So you can just click it into position and then leave it, and then you click it back and it shuts the shutter again, and that's a shot. In terms of the sort of settings, it really depends on the conditions. So obviously, broadly speaking, the closer the lightning, the brighter it is. So as a storm approaches, I typically tend to reduce the ISO number or put the F number a bit higher. But sort of typically, it's hard to give any numbers, but I usually use sort of ISO 100 to 200 and anything from about F5 to F8 or F9. But obviously, I'll vary with your lens a bit as well. But I hope that gives some idea anyway. And then in terms of safety, I guess it probably sounds a bit flippant, but I tend to find the main problem is getting near enough the flaming storm in the first place, because we don't get many of them and things. But yeah, I'd say the main, and people certainly say this storm chasing the States, the main danger actually is the driving. So you could be driving in very poor conditions and you're likely to be rather distracted, obviously, by the weather. So that's by far and away the most dangerous thing, I would say. Other than that, I guess if the lightning's very close and you want to keep getting the photos, you could use one of these remote control shutter release things. You could set the camera up and then go and control it from inside your car, which would be a lot safer. So.
What about lightning during the day?
Yes.
It,
so yeah, so I guess there's two options. So one is literally you just have to be really quick on the trigger. It sounds ridiculous, but some lightning bolts have a lot of return strokes, so you can actually react in time to capture one of the return strokes. But another thing you can do is to use a light meter. So this will detect sudden changes in light and it'll trigger the shutter then. So I've never had much success. I've tried that a few times, but never with any success. But I know people that have, and yeah, you don't see the branches with that technique. 'Cause you're only getting the return strokes. You just see the one single bolt without any of the branching. But yeah, it is possible, and certainly looks really spectacular if you can get decent storm cloud at sunset or something with the lightning. So.
A question on capturing color and detail in light conditions created by snow. How do you capture that color?
So I think often So some of it is the post-processing. I mean, I don't know much about post-processing. It's definitely something I could improve on, but some of it is just often because there's so much white in the shot, the camera it'll actually underexpose and it'll all look a little bit grey. So one thing I do is I tend to shoot it if it looks like that it's overexposed by sort of 1 or 2 notches. That gives a better result. And if it's the camera's telling you it's exactly correctly exposed, which, as I say, will tend to give you a lot of grey looking sort of surfaces in the shot. But other than that, I don't think there's anything particularly sort of special about snow per se. Although, you know, like with anything, it looks a lot better when you've got decent sunlight on the scene rather than just sort of lead in the sky. So.
What sort of camera settings do you use when photographing Noctilucent Clouds?
Gosh, I could put the settings on the screen, but I just realised that they couldn't be seen because that if I escape from my this is a sample of 2, so it might not be very useful, but I can tell you what I use for those. Yeah, so so ISO 320 f8, and it was a 3-second exposure. So I had a little mini tripod, one of those little mini grippy tripods. I'd actually put it up on the roof and was hanging out of a Velux window to get that particular shot. So probably not recommended. Yeah, and put the ISO up a little bit here, but similar kind of thing, really. But again, yeah, you do need, ideally, you need it to be mounted on a tripod and several second exposure, because it's pretty low intensity light, so you need a few seconds of exposure to get the detail, I would say.
What about do you need a wide angle lens for things like rainbows and the arcs and so on?
Yes, yeah, I think so I think it goes to about 24 millimeters, I think, the lens I've got, and you can just fit the sort of the regular 22-degree halo in shot with that. But yeah, certainly there's some phenomena that cover a much larger part of the sky that you might even need a fisheye lens to capture those.
You had one photograph of a whole double rainbow.
Yeah, so that was, and the same with the fog bows. Actually, they were I composited 2. I should have said, sorry, I composited 2 shots with this. So
so you stitched 2 pictures together.
That's right, yeah. So I think these would have been 2, and I try and take them around sort of 36 millimeters because the stitching seems to work better. If it's too wide angle when you do the stitching, it can struggle with the sort of distortion a little bit. So, yeah. But it's the same with the fog bows. So yeah, this was taken at 24 millimeters, and again it was a stitch of 2 shots.
You mentioned about so keeping your camera dry, but you're challenging it in all the time. How do you reconcile that?
So with storms, actually, I mean, I've tried different sort of rain covers for the camera, but to be quite honest, I found the easiest thing to do is just get a decent sized towel and just put it over the top of the camera. If you can use a lens hood as well, that can just keep a bit of the rain off the lens itself. But yeah, it's something I do struggle with, and I've had, sometimes I've got so much water into the camera that the controls they stopped working properly on the back, so I've had to dry the poor thing out at home. But unfortunately, it always seems to have been fine after a few hours. But yeah, it's again probably not advisable.
You go through a lot of cameras.
Yeah, the worst thing is sea spray, obviously, and I mean that can be just impossible to keep off the lens because it drifts in the wind. So yeah, you really need to properly wipe it with a sort of cloth and try and get all the salt off when you've been near the coast.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's more or less all the questions. Someone's asking about whether the slides are shared. I think they are available on the talk is available on the website after today, if I remember our conversation earlier. So you can look at them there. So thank you very much for your talk.